The woman who stepped off the stagecoach in Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1882 gave her name as Irene Holloway, and every single word of it was a lie. She stood on the packed dirt of the main street with a carpet bag in one hand and a resolve in her chest like iron, watching the dust settle around her boots as the driver threw down the last of the luggage and cracked his whip and moved on without so much as a backward glance. That was the thing about stagecoach drivers. They never asked questions, and they never looked back. She had counted on exactly that when she had paid her fare in Wichita, pressing coins into a calloused palm and climbing in beside a traveling salesman who smelled of bay rum and kept trying to sell her a bottle of patent medicine she did not need. Caldwell was a cattle town, sitting right on the Kansas Indian Territory border, and in the spring of 1882, it was one of the last of the great trailhead towns still doing serious business, though the railroads were already threading themselves south and everyone with half a brain could see the writing on the wall. The cattle drives up from Texas were still rumbling through, though. The Kishom Trail still had life in it yet. Cowboys still came riding in after 3 months of hard country, filthy and trail-sore, and eager to spend their wages on a warm meal and a cold drink, and maybe a dance if the mood was right. The town had 2 saloons, a hotel, a general store, a livery, a bank, a church that held services on Sunday mornings and prayer meetings on Wednesday evenings, a sheriff's office with bars on the windows, and a land office where men with money and ambition could file claims on parcels of the territory just south of the line. She stood in front of the land office and read the painted sign 3 times, her lips pressed together, her chin lifted the way a woman lifts her chin when she is deciding whether she is afraid or not. She had decided she was not afraid when she left Abilene 6 weeks ago. She had decided it again in Wichita. She was deciding it a 3rd time now, here in Caldwell, with dust on her skirts and the late morning sun pressing down on her dark hair. And it was getting easier each time she made the decision, which she supposed was the point. A man came out of the land office before she could go in, nearly running straight into her, catching himself on the door frame and pulling his hat off in one smooth motion that suggested it was a habit so deep it had become reflex. "Beg your pardon, ma'am," he said. She looked at him. He was tall, broad in the shoulder, with the kind of tan that came from spending serious time outdoors and not from any accident of birth. His hair was the color of good saddle leather, darker where it had been pressed by his hat, and his eyes were a clear, honest gray that she noticed without meaning to. He wore a work shirt and suspenders and practical boots with mud still caked on the heels from what she guessed was a morning doing something on the land rather than in town, and he held his hat in both hands now, turning it slightly, a gesture she recognized as a man who was taking a moment to actually look at her rather than past her. Most men in most towns looked past a woman traveling alone. This one did not. "No harm done," she said, and moved to step around him. "Are you looking to file a claim?" he asked, and there was nothing pushy in it, no presumption, only a kind of genuine curiosity, as if the question came from the same place as the hat lifting, which was a real and unremarkable courtesy rather than a performance. She stopped. "I might be. The land agent's in a meeting right now," he said. "He'll be another half hour, maybe 40 minutes. There's a place across the street that makes a decent cup of coffee if you don't want to stand in the sun." She considered him for a moment. In 6 weeks of traveling alone, she had learned very quickly to read the difference between men who offered assistance because they genuinely meant it and men who offered it because they thought it opened a door to something else. This man stood squarely in his own boots and looked at her with the gray eyes and waited, entirely without urgency, and she thought that if he had intended to push, he would have pushed already. "Coffee," she said, "would be welcome." The place was a narrow room with 4 tables and a counter, and a woman named Mrs. Bauer who wore her hair in a braid as thick as a rope and did not smile at anyone but kept their cups full without being asked, which Irene thought was a far better quality in a woman than smiling. They sat across from each other, and Irene wrapped her hands around the cup and felt the warmth move up through her palms, and he said, "Matthew Abbott," and held out his hand across the table. She took it. "Irene Holloway," she said. He nodded once, the way a man nods when he has heard a name, and stored it and moved on. He did not repeat it back at her with an approving sound. He did not comment on it. He did not ask if she had people in the area or a husband coming to meet her. He simply put his own hands around his own cup and said, "You come far." "Far enough," she said. "From the territory, from the north." He accepted that. They drank coffee. Outside on the street, a wagon rolled past and two horses stood tied to the rail in front of the saloon 2 doors down, and somewhere in the middle distance a dog was barking at something it thought was interesting. After a moment he said, "The land agent's name is Cyrus Pratt. He's honest enough, but he talks in circles when he's nervous. So if you have a specific piece of land in mind, tell him the parcel number straight off, and don't let him get going on his general remarks about soil quality, because you'll be there until supper." She looked at him across the cup. "How do you know I have a specific piece in mind?" "Because you stood outside and read that sign 3 times, he said. "And a person who already knows what they want reads the sign to make sure they've arrived at the right place, not to decide whether they're going in." She was quiet for a moment. "You were watching me," she said. "I came out of the building," he said simply. "I nearly ran you over." "I noticed." He said it without apology or embarrassment, just as a fact of the situation, and she found that she could not argue with it because he was right. "Parcel 47, she said. "Southeast of the Salt Fork. I read about it in a newspaper notice 3 months ago." Something moved in his expression. Not surprise exactly, but a kind of focused attention, as if the number had particular meaning for him. "That's good land," he said. "River access, good grass. Bit of timber on the east edge. You know it." "I know most of the parcels down here," he said. "I have a ranch about 4 miles northwest of that piece. I've been trying to buy 47 for 2 years. The original claimant let it lapse, and it went back to the Territory Land Office and then came available through the federal rolls." He paused. "I didn't put in a competing bid." "Why not?" He looked at her steadily. "Because someone else wanted it more." She held his gaze. "You don't know that." "You stood outside and read the sign 3 times, he said again, with the faintest edge of warmth in it, not quite a smile, but close enough that she felt it. She did not know what to do with a man like this, so she finished her coffee and thanked him and went across the street to file her claim. Cyrus Pratt was exactly as Matthew Abbott had described. He was a small, fussy man with ink on his fingers and a habit of starting sentences that wound through 3 subordinate clauses before arriving anywhere useful. And when Irene gave him the parcel number directly and without preamble, she saw the relief on his face as clearly as if she had handed him something he had dropped. She filed the claim in the name of Irene Holloway. She signed the paper in the name of Irene Holloway. She paid the filing fee with money that had been earned by a woman who was not Irene Holloway, in a city she had left quickly and without ceremony. And when Pratt stamped the form and slid her copy across the desk with a congratulatory murmur about the excellent quality of the Salt Fork bottomland, she folded it carefully and put it in the inside pocket of her traveling coat, close to her chest. She had a piece of land. She had a name. She had enough money for seed and basic tools, and 3 months of supplies if she was careful. She had learned to be careful. She found a room at the hotel, a plain room with a good lock on the door and a window that faced east so the morning light came in clean and direct. She paid a week in advance and asked the woman at the desk where she could find a carpenter or a builder, someone who could tell her what condition the existing structures on parcel 47 were in, since the land office records suggested there was a partial cabin started by the original claimant before he had abandoned the claim. The woman at the desk, whose name was Mrs. Jean Harker, and who was perhaps 55 years old and had the particular economy of movement that comes from running a hotel with her own 2 hands for many years, looked at her with a frank and measuring attention that was not unkind. "You're going to work that land yourself?" Mrs. Harker asked. "I am." "Alone, to start with?" Mrs. Harker was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The man you want is Hector Vega. He's a builder who works out of the south part of town. He knows every structure on every parcel within 10 miles of here. He's fair in his prices and he doesn't think women are made of porcelain." She paused. "Out here, that last part matters more than you might think." "I know it does," Irene said. She found Hector Vega the next morning, a compact, serious man of perhaps 45 who was finishing the framing on a new feed barn at the edge of town. He listened to her description of the parcel, asked 3 specific and intelligent questions about the water access and the elevation of the building site relative to the river, and agreed to ride out with her the following day to take a look. That evening, sitting at the long table in the hotel dining room with a plate of roast beef and boiled potatoes in front of her, she became aware that Matthew Abbott was eating at the same table, 3 seats down, with another man she did not know. He noticed her about the same time she noticed him, and he lifted his chin in a brief, civil acknowledgement, and she returned it, and then they both went back to their respective meals. But when supper was finished and she was rising from the table, he said, "Miss Holloway," she turned. "Are you going out to look at the parcel tomorrow?" "I am." "The crossing at the Salt Fork can run high in the spring," he said. "There's a low-water ford about a half-mile east of the main trail that's easier to manage. I'd tell Vega if you haven't already." She studied him. "Why are you being helpful to me?" she asked, and she meant it as a real question, not a reproach. He considered it seriously, which she had not entirely expected. "Because you're new here and I know the country," he said, "and because the ford matters. A wagon can tip in that crossing when the water's high and it would set you back in a way that doesn't need to happen." She nodded slowly. "Thank you," she said. "I'll tell him." She turned to go and then stopped, not quite looking back at him. "How do you know Vega?" "He built my barn," Matthew said. "He does good work." She did go to the parcel the next morning, riding out with Hector Vega on a clear April day with the prairie grass still winter pale at the roots but greening at the tips, and the sky so wide and blue above the flat land that it felt less like weather and more like a decision the world had made about itself. She told Vega about the ford, and he nodded without comment, which she took to mean it was useful information. The parcel was better than she had allowed herself to hope. The Salt Fork ran along the southern edge of it, shallow and clear in the morning light, with cottonwoods standing along the bank in the beginning of their leaf. The grass was good in the bottomland. The timber on the east edge was modest, a line of hackberry and elm that would serve for wind protection and fuel. The existing cabin was 3 walls and a partial roof, abandoned mid-construction, but the foundation was sound, and the work that had been done was competent. Vega walked around it twice, tested the corner posts, looked at the roof line, and said he could have it finished in 3 weeks for a price that was reasonable and that she had enough money to cover. She stood in what would be the doorway of the cabin and looked south across the bottomland toward the river, and felt something she had not felt in a very long time, which was the specific and interior quality of being exactly where you are supposed to be. She knew it was not entirely hers, this feeling. She knew the name on the claim was borrowed. She knew the money that had funded the journey had a complicated history. But the land itself, the river, the cottonwoods, the greening grass, that was real in a way that names were not, and she pressed her hand against the unfinished door frame and let herself have the feeling for a moment before she put it away in the same careful pocket where she kept everything else that was too important to lose. Vega began work the following Monday with 2 men he brought from town. Irene camped on the land in a tent she had bought at the general store, sleeping on a bedroll and waking before dawn to start a fire and make coffee, and watch the light come across the prairie with a kind of aching attention that felt almost like prayer. On the 3rd day of construction, Matthew Abbott rode out. She heard his horse before she saw him, a steady, unhurried sound on the track that led from the main trail to the property, and she was standing near the fire with a mug in her hand when he came around the hackberry stand and pulled up at a polite distance from the camp. "Morning," he said, hat in hand before he was even properly stopped. "Morning," she said. "Light." She held up the coffee pot. I wouldn't say no." He tied his horse to a branch and came to the fire and took the tin cup she poured for him, and they stood on opposite sides of the fire in the early morning quiet and listened to the sound of hammering from the direction of the cabin, which was already taking on a shape that you could look at and call a thing rather than a collection of materials. "It's going well," he said, looking in the direction of the hammering. "It is. Vega's fast." "He is." A silence not uncomfortable. The fire popped. A meadowlark somewhere in the grass made its long, liquid sound. "Where are you from?" he asked, and there was no angle to it, no prying. It sounded like the kind of question a person asks when they genuinely want to know the shape of another person's life. "Missouri," she said, and that was true. It was one of the true things. "Family there." "Not anymore," she said, and that was also true. There was a grave in a churchyard outside of a town called Meridian, her mother, who had died of fever in the winter of 1879, and a stepfather who was alive and whom she preferred not to think about, and that was the sum total of it. He did not press. He drank his coffee and looked at the prairie, and then asked her something about her plans for the land, whether she intended to run cattle or farm, and they talked about that for a while because she had been thinking about it hard and had actual opinions. And he had opinions too, ones that were specific and grounded in the particular character of the Salt Fork bottomland, and she found that she was interested in what he said. He knew this country the way someone knows a thing they have lived alongside for years rather than studied for a test. He had come to Kansas from Ohio, he told her, in 1874, when he was 20 years old. He had worked as a hired hand on 3 different ranches over 4 years, learning the country and saving money, and then he had put together enough to take a claim on his own piece and start building. He was 28 now. He had 30 head of good cattle and a solid barn, and a house that was not fancy but was weather-tight and had a decent stove. She was listening to this and doing arithmetic in her head, and found that he was telling her these things not as a catalog of his assets, the way a man sometimes presents his material worth to a woman he is measuring, but as a narrative, the way someone tells a story they think the other person might find genuinely interesting. She was 24. She had been living under someone else's name for 7 weeks. She had been living under someone else's authority for most of her adult life before that. She had a parcel of land and a partial cabin, and a name she had taken from a woman she had read about in a newspaper, a woman who had died in a flood near St. Louis in the winter of 1881, a widow with no family, a name that had belonged to no one anymore, and that she had picked up like a thing that had been set down and forgotten. She thought about telling him this. She thought about it as a completely irrational impulse, and kept her mouth closed and asked him instead whether the cattle market was strong in Caldwell that spring. He came back on the 5th day and the 8th day, and brought a tin of good coffee and a bag of dried beans the 2nd time, practical things that a person camping on their land would actually use, presented without ceremony, set beside the fire without drama, and she accepted them in the same spirit. On the 12th day, Vega pronounced the cabin finished. It was tight, straight, well-made, with a solid door and 2 windows and a plank floor, and a good fireplace on the north wall that drew cleanly. She stood inside it and put her hands on the windowsill and looked out at the river and thought, with a kind of ferocious, quiet joy that she was careful not to show too much on her face in front of Vega and his men, that she had done it. She had gotten herself here. She had made a place. She thanked Vega and paid him and shook his hand, and he gave her a look that was the closest she had seen him come to warmth, which was a single nod that contained inside it a recognition of something, and then he loaded his tools and his men and drove back toward town. She was alone on her land in her cabin for the first time. She sat on the floor with her back against the wall and put her face in her hands and allowed herself 3 minutes of crying, which was not sadness precisely, but more the releasing of a tension so long held that, when it finally eased, it came out in something that resembled grief only in its outward form. Then she wiped her face and got up and started making a list of what she needed to do next. She needed a kitchen garden. She needed chickens. She needed a plow and the muscle to pull it, which meant either hiring someone or buying a mule, and a mule was the more sustainable investment. She needed a water barrel and a proper arrangement for getting water from the river to the cabin. She needed seed, several kinds, and she needed to get it in the ground within the next 3 weeks if she wanted a real growing season. She went to town twice in the next week, buying and arranging and carrying, and on the second trip she met Loretta Ashby, who ran a small poultry operation east of town and was willing to sell her 6 laying hens and a rooster at a fair price. And Loretta Ashby turned out to be a woman of 40, sharp-eyed and plain-spoken, who had come to Kansas as a young widow and built her small holding from nearly nothing, and who looked at Irene the way women who have survived difficult things look at other women they suspect have survived difficult things, which is with a specific and unspoken recognition. "You got people nearby?" Loretta asked, tying the legs of the last hen before putting her in the crate. "Not yet," Irene said. "You will," Loretta said, not as a prediction but as a statement of something she believed to be inevitable about people who commit themselves to a piece of land. "The land brings them. You stay long enough, the country introduces you." Matthew Abbott had been introducing himself for nearly 3 weeks by then, incrementally, without pressure, each visit slightly more familiar than the last in the way that incremental things become when both parties allow them to. He had helped her carry the water barrel from town to the claim in his wagon without being asked to do so, simply appearing on the main trail at the right moment, and saying he had room in the bed, and it was on his way. She had let him help because the barrel was genuinely too heavy to manage alone, and because she was learning to distinguish between help that eroded something and help that simply solved a problem. He helped in the way of the latter. It was in the 4th week of May that the thing happened that changed the texture of everything between them. She had been working in the kitchen garden, which was taking shape well, the soil in the bottomland being the kind of rich, dark loam that responds to attention with an almost immediate generosity. She was on her knees between the bean rows when she heard a horse coming fast on the track, not Matthew's familiar, unhurried pace but something urgent, and she stood and shaded her eyes, and saw a man she did not know pulling up hard outside her fence with a face that had alarm written on it. "Ma'am," he said, barely stopping the horse, "you're Irene Holloway, the new claim on 47. "I am. There's a man at the land office in town saying your claim is invalid. He's got a lawyer with him. Name of Delwood. You'd better come." Her heart dropped straight through the ground and she felt cold in the bright May sunshine. She thought, this is it. This is where it ends. They have found out who I am and the name doesn't hold and everything falls apart here in the bean rows 4 weeks in. She tied her apron to the fence post and went. The man at the land office was not a lawman and did not appear to know anything about who she was or was not. He was a cattle baron type, thick in the neck, with a real lawyer beside him who wore a coat that had been expensive once and still intended to communicate that it had been. His name was Arvid Chance, and he claimed that Parcel 47 had been informally promised to him by the original claimant before that man had abandoned it, and that the federal filing was therefore conducted in bad faith. Irene stood in Cyrus Pratt's office and listened to Arvid Chance make this argument and felt the cold recede and the iron return, because this was not about her name or her past. This was about land, and land was a thing she understood how to fight for, because she had been studying exactly how to fight for it since she first read the newspaper notice 3 months ago. The original claimant's name was Thomas Birch, she said, when Chance had finished. He abandoned the claim in October of 1881. The claim reverted to the federal land rolls on November 3rd of that same year, as recorded in this office. I filed on April 17th of 1882, which is 5.5 months after the reversion. Any informal promise made by Mr. Birch to Mr. Chance before the abandonment has no standing against a lawful federal filing, because at the time of any such promise, Mr. Birch was already in default on his improvement obligations, and the land was effectively already reverting. The lawyer looked at her. Pratt looked at her. Arvid Chance turned a color that was somewhere between red and purple and said, "Now, see here." "Do you have documentation of this alleged promise?" she asked. A silence. Any written correspondence, any witness willing to testify to its terms? The lawyer put a hand on Chance's arm and they stepped to the corner and spoke in low voices for a moment, and when they came back the lawyer said they would be in touch and they left. Pratt looked at her with an expression that combined admiration and mild fright. "That was," he started. "Accurate," she said. "I read the law before I filed." She walked out of the land office on legs that were steadier than she expected. She stood on the step in the May sunshine and breathed. "That bad," said a voice she recognized. She looked up. Matthew Abbott was leaning against the hitching post outside, his arms folded, his hat brim shading his face from the sun. "You knew I was in there," she said. "I saw you riding fast, and I know Arvid Chance's horse." He paused. "How did it go?" she told him. All of it calmly, exactly as it had happened. He listened with the gray eyes steady on her, and when she was done he said, "Chance will try again. He's not a man who gives up easily when he decides he wants something. He'll look for another angle." "I know. Let me know if he does," Matthew said. Something in the directness of it, the simple offered availability of it, made something tighten in her chest. "You don't owe me anything," she said, and she meant it. She was not being falsely modest. "I know I don't," he said. "I'm offering anyway." She looked at him for a long moment in the May sunshine. This tall, gray-eyed man who had nearly run her over coming out of a building 5 weeks ago, and who had brought her coffee and helped carry a barrel, and told her about river crossings, and had now apparently been watching over her while she handled a legal confrontation she had not expected. And she thought about how badly she wanted to trust someone, and how frightened she was of what trusting him fully would require. "Why?" she asked. It came out quieter than she intended. He was quiet for a moment, taking the question seriously the way she had noticed he took most things seriously. "Because I think you're doing something real out here," he said. "And I don't like watching real things get run over by people like Chance." He paused. "And because I'd like to keep knowing you, Irene." He said her name. It landed differently than it had when she had said it to him that first morning. It landed like something he had decided to say, chosen specifically in the way you choose a thing when you understand its weight. She said, "You'd better come to supper then. Saturday. I've got chickens now and I mean to use them." He smiled. It was the first full smile she had seen from him, unhurried and genuine, and it rearranged his face in a way she had not quite anticipated, warming the gray eyes, making him look younger and also somehow more himself. "I'll be there," he said. The supper was on a Saturday in late May with the evening warm and the cottonwoods along the river throwing long shadows across the grass. She had made a chicken stew with vegetables from the garden, the early radishes and the greens already coming up, and cornbread in the cast-iron skillet, and she had put a cloth on the small table she had made from planks Vega had left, 2 barrels and a door, which was not furniture exactly but served the purpose. Matthew came on time, which she took as a mark of respect. He brought a jar of honey from some source he did not explain, and a handful of early wildflowers that he had clearly picked along the trail, and which were slightly drooping from the ride, and he held them out with a directness that was neither sheepish nor grand about it, just a man bringing a small thing because he had wanted to. She put them in a tin cup with water and set them on the table. They ate and talked. He told her about the first winter he had spent in Kansas, 1874, when he had not entirely understood how cold it could get on the plains. Not cold the way Ohio was cold, with the cold muffled by trees and hills, but cold in the open and absolute way of flat country, the wind coming straight from the north with nothing to slow it for 500 miles, the temperature dropping hard and staying hard for weeks, and how he had learned that winter what it meant to take weather seriously. She told him about Missouri, the real parts, growing up in a small town near the river with her mother, who had been a school teacher and who had read to her every night until she was old enough to read for herself, and then read alongside her, the two of them on opposite sides of the same lamp. "She sounds like a good woman," Matthew said. "She was the best person I knew," Irene said, and it came out simply and completely, without the careful modulation she usually applied to personal things. He looked at her across the table, and she saw the sympathy in the gray eyes, not the uncomfortable kind that needs to do something with itself, but the quiet kind that simply acknowledges and stays. "How long ago?" he asked. "3 years," she said. "The winter of 1879, he nodded. They were quiet for a moment, and it was a good quiet, the kind that holds something between two people rather than separating them. "My father died the year before I came west," he said. "My mother had gone when I was 12. I had a sister who married a man in Columbus. When my father went, there wasn't much to keep me in Ohio." He said it without self-pity. "I don't regret coming. This country got into me. I couldn't go back to somewhere smaller now if I tried." "I understand that," she said, looking out the window toward the river where the last of the light was still sitting on the water in thin gold lines. "I felt it the first morning I woke up out here. Something about the size of it." "Yes," he said, "just that." Yes, as though she had said something that exactly matched a thing he had been thinking for years and had not found the right words for. They sat at the table long after the food was finished, talking, while the dark came on outside and the coyote started up in the distance and the fire in the fireplace burned down to good coals. She lit the lamp. Its light made a circle of warmth in the small cabin and pushed the dark out to the edges, and she thought that this was the first evening since she had arrived in Caldwell when she had felt genuinely, freely comfortable. He rode home at an hour that was late but not scandalously so, and she stood in the doorway and watched the sound of his horse fade on the night trail, and then went inside and sat by the fire and thought about what she was doing. She was doing something she had decided not to do. She was letting someone in. She was letting him build a picture of her from the outside in, one meal and one conversation at a time, and the picture he was building was made partly of true things and partly of a borrowed name. And at some point, if this continued in the direction it seemed to be going, which she was not going to pretend she was unaware of, he was going to be owed the true picture. She sat with that, and it was heavy and complicated, and she did not resolve it that night. He came back on the following Wednesday, not for supper, but just passing by in the mid-morning, and stopping to tell her that he had heard Arvid Chance had hired a second lawyer from Wichita, which meant he was serious about making a challenge. He stayed long enough to help her set the fence post that had been giving her trouble since Monday, the one on the north corner that kept leaning because the ground there had a hidden softness to it that resisted proper setting, and they worked on it together in the morning heat, Matthew doing the heavy work without making a performance of it, and she doing the measuring and the leveling with the precision she had discovered she had for such things. The post stood straight. They stood back and looked at it. "Good fence," he said. "It will be," she said. He looked at her sidelong with a hint of that warmth that was becoming familiar to her. "You're not afraid of much, are you?" he said, and it was not quite a question. "I'm afraid of plenty," she said honestly. "I've just learned that being afraid doesn't mean you have to stop." He thought about that for a moment. "Where did you learn that?" "From my mother," she said, and that was entirely true. Clara, her mother, had been a schoolteacher in a town that had not always been kind to schoolteachers who read the wrong books or asked the wrong questions, and she had kept going anyway, quietly and consistently, the way water finds its way through, not by force but by persistence. June came in hot, and the garden responded with the gratitude of good soil given water and attention. She had beans and squash and tomatoes starting up, and the corn was knee-high in its rows. The chickens were laying reliably, and she had sold a dozen eggs to Mrs. Bauer at the coffee house, who had taken them without comment but had given her a good price, and to Loretta Ashby, who laughed and said she was competing with herself now, and she didn't mind a bit. The challenge from Arvid Chance materialized in the second week of June in the form of a letter delivered by the sheriff, whose name was Walt Odell, a lean, weathered man in his 50s, who clearly took no pleasure in delivering legal correspondence to women on their own land, but who did his duty about it. The letter claimed that the original claimant, Thomas Birch, had entered into a binding verbal agreement with Chance, and that a sworn affidavit from Birch himself would be submitted to the land office by July 1st. Irene read it twice, then went to find Matthew. She found him at his ranch, which was 4 miles northwest of her parcel, a working ranch with a real house on it, 2-story, solid, with a kitchen garden of its own, and a barn she could see Vega's hand in from 50 feet away, and a yard with a water pump that actually worked, and 3 hands who were doing various things involving cattle and fence wire. He came out of the barn when he heard her horse and took one look at her face and said, "Come inside." She gave him the letter. He read it at the kitchen table while she sat across from him and watched his face and found that she was reading him as carefully as he read the paper, which told her something about how much she had come to trust his reactions. "Thomas Birch," he said. "He went back to Texas after he abandoned the claim, or so I heard, but if Chance got to him, he stopped." He looked at her. "This is serious, Irene. Chance has money and he has patience. A sworn affidavit from the original claimant could be enough to throw the filing into dispute, even if you're legally right. The process alone could cost you." She knew this. She had been thinking about exactly this since the sheriff had ridden away. "What do I do?" she asked. "You need a lawyer," he said. "A real one, not a county clerk and not your own preparation, good as that was. Someone who can represent you formally. The nearest one who isn't already working for someone like Chance." "Wichita," he said. "There's a man named Harmon Dye who does land law and he's not beholden to anyone down here. He's expensive, but he's good." "How expensive?" Matthew told her the number he had in mind, and she calculated quickly, and her face must have done something because he said, "I can lend you what you need. No interest, repayable whenever you're able." She looked at him. "No," she said. "Irene, I mean it," she said. "I'm not going to take money from you, Matthew. If I lose this on money, then I was under-resourced from the start and I need to find another way to solve it." He pressed his lips together in the way she had noticed he did when he was rearranging his approach. "All right," he said. "Then let's think about what you have." They sat at his kitchen table for an hour. His housekeeper, a quiet Mexican woman named Esperanza who moved through the house with the efficiency of long practice, brought coffee and a plate of something that smelled of chilies and corn, and they ate and talked and worked through what Irene had. The documentation, the dates, the sequence of the reversion, the absence of any written evidence of Chance's alleged agreement with Birch, and the significant legal principle that a verbal contract regarding federal land did not supersede a lawful federal claim. "The problem," Matthew said, "is Birch's affidavit if Chance actually gets it. Because even if you're right on the law, the affidavit introduces a factual dispute that could drag this through a territorial court for 6 months or a year, and a claim in dispute is a claim you can't fully build on without risk." "What would you do?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "I'd go find Thomas Birch before Chance can get a sworn statement from him." She looked at him steadily. "You mean go to Texas? Or wherever he is?" Word around the county was he went back to the hill country. "Fredericksburg area." He paused. "I know people down that way. I could write ahead." "Matthew," she said carefully, "I'm grateful for everything you're telling me. But I need to be the one who does this." He looked at her with the gray eyes that she had come to find over these past weeks, that they did not flinch or slide away from difficult things. "Why?" he asked, not confrontationally, genuinely. "Because this is my land and my fight," she said. "And because if someone else solves every problem for me, then I'm not really out here alone. I'm just somewhere else with a different person managing my life." A silence. He turned his cup in his hands. "I understand that," he said. "I do. But going to Texas alone as a woman on a legal errand. Women have gone to Texas alone before," she said. "Not on my watch," he said, and then he looked as if he wished he had chosen different words because they were more than he had intended to put on the table. His jaw tightened slightly and he looked at the cup and then back at her. "That came out different than I meant it." "How did you mean it?" she asked, and she was aware that the air in the room had changed, had become something other than purely practical. He set the cup down. He looked at her with an honesty so direct and unguarded that it was almost uncomfortable. "I meant that I care what happens to you," he said. "I don't know exactly when that started, but it's true, and I'm not going to pretend it isn't just to avoid saying something inconvenient." He stopped. "If I'm overstepping, tell me." She was very still. Outside the kitchen window, the Kansas afternoon was golden and enormous, and a meadowlark was doing its thing in the grass. "You're not overstepping," she said, and her voice was quieter than usual. He looked at her and she looked at him, and neither of them moved for a moment that had weight and warmth in it simultaneously. Then she said, "Come with me to Texas." He blinked. "You just said you have contacts in the hill country," she said. "And you're right that going alone is a risk I don't need to take if I have a choice. I'm not asking you to solve it. I'm asking you to come alongside me while I solve it. There's a difference." The slow smile started in the corners of his eyes. "There is a difference," he agreed. They made arrangements. He had a hand who could manage the ranch for a week. She arranged with Loretta Ashby to check on the chickens and the garden. She wrote to Harmon Dye in Wichita explaining the situation and asking for written guidance on the legal points she could use when she spoke to Thomas Birch. She packed practical things. They left on a Monday in the second week of June, riding south on a good trail through the Indian Territory and into Texas, which in 1882 was not an entirely simple journey. The territory was settled in complex and sometimes volatile ways, with communities and agreements and tensions that the land itself did not acknowledge and that travelers needed to be respectful of. Matthew knew the territory well enough to navigate it thoughtfully. He had trading relationships with several communities along the way, and he handled every interaction with the same unhurried, direct respect he gave to everyone. And Irene watched this and thought about what it meant. The fact that courtesy to him was not situational but structural. They rode side by side for 2 days on open country and talked more continuously than they had ever talked before, because riding gives conversation a particular quality, the rhythm of horses and the breadth of sky loosening things that walls and tables keep more contained. She told him more about her mother, about Missouri, about what her life had been like in the years after her mother died. She told him about the stepfather whose name was Gerald without quite saying everything about Gerald, but enough that he understood why she had left. He was quiet for a bit after she said that, and then he asked carefully, "Did he hurt you?" "Not with his hands," she said. "He hurt the way small men hurt, controlling the money, the movement, who I could speak to and who I couldn't, taking what my mother left me and calling it safekeeping." She paused. "I left with what I could carry and what I could get access to, and I made it enough." She felt him go still on the horse beside her, a contained stillness that she had learned to recognize as the way he managed strong feeling. "He sounds like a coward," he said. "He is," she agreed. "But he's also 400 miles north, and I don't intend to go back." "Good," Matthew said, simply and completely, and did not add anything to it. That night they camped in a draw with good water and a windbreak of cedar, and she built the fire while he tended the horses, and they ate salt pork and beans and the cornbread she had packed and drank coffee under a sky so thick with stars it seemed almost architectural. She had never thought of the stars as architectural before, but out here on the open land, so far from town and lamp, they had a structure to them, a presence, like something built. "Matthew," she said, and it was the first time she had said his name at the beginning of a sentence rather than at the end of one, and she noticed it and she thought he did too. He said. She looked at the fire. She had been arguing with herself about this for several days. She had argued herself out of it twice and the argument had not held. "My name is not Irene Holloway." The fire between them was the only sound for a moment. Then he said, "No." "No," she said. Irene Holloway was a woman who died in a flood near St. Louis in January of 1881. I found her name in a newspaper notice. She was a widow with no family. I took her name when I left Abilene because I needed one that Gerald couldn't follow, and because Irene Holloway's death certificate was public record and I could memorize the details. She kept her eyes on the fire. The claim is filed in that name. Everything in Caldwell is in that name. A silence that went on long enough to be uncomfortable. "What is your name?" he asked. She looked up at him. His face was absolutely without alarm or judgment. He was watching her across the fire with the gray eyes attentive and patient and waiting. "Eliza Crane," she said. It was the first time she had said it aloud in 7 weeks. Her own name in her own voice in the open air. "Eliza Me Crane from Meridian, Missouri." He said it once quietly as if he was hearing what it sounded like. "Eliza." "Yes." Another silence. She could not read it entirely, and that frightened her, not the old fear but a new one specific to him, the fear that she had miscalculated and that this was where the thing between them broke apart on the rocks of a borrowed name. "Gerald Crane," he said. "Is that his name?" "Gerald Marsh," she said. "He took my mother's name when he married her." Convenient habit, taking other people's names. A flicker of something in Matthew's expression. "This changes the claim," he said. "I know. The claim is filed as Irene Holloway." "If it came out that the filer was someone else." "I know," she said again. "Chance could use it." "Yes." He was quiet, looking at the fire, and she waited. "Why are you telling me?" he asked, and it was not an accusation, it was the real question, the one underneath everything. "Because you asked me for the real one," she said, and he looked up sharply. "You've asked me where I'm from and who I am and what I think and what I want. Nobody in Caldwell has done that. Everyone has taken the name and moved on. You kept asking." He looked at her. "And you kept wanting someone to know," he said, with a gentleness that she had not expected from a man who was also clearly working through serious practical implications. "I am tired," she said, quietly and entirely honestly, "of being someone else." He leaned forward and put more wood on the fire, and then he sat back and looked at her for a long, steady moment. "Here's what I think," he said. "What you did was not nothing. You stepped outside the law to protect yourself from a man who had made your life impossible, and you built something real with whatever you had. That matters." He paused. "And I also think that building on a false foundation is not sustainable, not for the land and not for you." "I know that too," she said. "So what do we do about it?" he said, and the "we" landed gently and completely, and she felt it in her chest. She had thought about this. "There's a process," she said. "A legal process for correcting a filing. If I go to the land office voluntarily, before any challenge surfaces this issue, and explain that the filing was made in an alias due to a situation of personal duress, and file a correction with my real name, with documentation of who I am, the claim itself is not necessarily invalidated. The land is mine by the filing date and the improvement I've done. The name is a different matter. You've talked to a lawyer about this." "I wrote to Harmon Dye," she said, not giving him the specifics but asking hypothetical questions. His response suggested it was possible to correct a filing if the circumstances were legitimate. Matthew nodded slowly. "And you think they were legitimate?" "I think I was a woman with no money and no options trying to survive a man who had made himself legally her guardian after my mother died, and who was using that position to keep me from leaving," she said. "I think the name I used belonged to no one. I think the land I filed on was genuinely available. I think I have improved it and intend to improve it further." She stopped. "I think a territorial judge with any sense would look at all of that and see a woman who did what she had to." "I think so too," he said. She let out a breath she had been holding for 7 weeks. It came out slowly, all the way to the bottom of her lungs, and she felt lighter and also more exposed, like a thing that has been under pressure for a long time and which, when the pressure releases, takes a moment to remember its own shape. "Eliza," he said again, and now he was not testing the name. He was using it. "Does it feel different, having someone know?" "Yes," she said. "It feels like something I didn't realize was wrong has gone back to the way it should be." He looked at her across the fire for a long moment, and the stars were enormous above them, and the cedar smelled clean on the night air, and she thought that she would remember this fire this night, the specific quality of his gray eyes in the firelight, for a very long time. They found Thomas Birch in Fredericksburg, Texas, on the fourth day of travel, in exactly the location Matthew's contact had identified. He was a wiry, weathered man of perhaps 60 who had built himself a modest house on the edge of a pecan grove and who seemed to have put Kansas firmly behind him. He received them on his porch with the wariness of a man who has had difficult visitors before and knows how to look at them carefully before deciding what to do. Irene did the talking. She explained who she was, the real version, including the alias and why she had used it, because she had decided on the trail that going forward as herself was the only approach that was sustainable, and because she thought Birch was a man who would respond better to honesty than to legal pressure. She was right. Thomas Birch listened to her, the whole of it, and then he looked at Matthew and back at her and said, "Chance already wrote to me. Wants me to sign something saying I promised him that land." "Did you?" she asked. "We talked about it," he said. "It wasn't a deal. It was a conversation I had with him at a saloon the night before I decided to give the whole thing up and go home. He bought me a drink and said he'd be interested in the parcel if I didn't make it work. That's not a promise." He spat off the side of the porch. "I told his man I wasn't signing anything." Irene felt the relief move through her. "Would you be willing to put that in writing?" she asked. "A simple statement that your conversation with Chance was not a binding agreement, and that you had no understanding with him when you abandoned the claim." Birch looked at her for a moment. "You going to make something of that land?" he asked. "I already have," she said. "I've got a garden going and the cabin finished, and I intend to run cattle in time." He was quiet for a bit, looking at the pecan trees. "My wife died out there," he said. "That's why I left. Fever took her in September of '81 and I couldn't stay after that." A pause. "I'd like to think someone is going to make something good on that ground. She would have liked it, I think, if someone made something good." "I intend to," Irene said. Thomas Birch signed a written statement, dated and witnessed by Matthew, attesting that no binding agreement had been made with Arvid Chance. He signed it without being asked twice and without asking for anything in return, and when they shook hands he held hers for a moment and said, "Good luck to you, Miss Crane." The first time anyone had called her that in 7 weeks. She almost said, "Thank you, Mrs. Birch's land will be in good hands." But it seemed too much to say, too personal, too near to a grief she had only just learned about, and so she said simply, "Thank you, Mr. Birch," and meant everything she didn't say alongside it. The ride back was different from the ride south. Not in its physical character, the same country, the same sky, the same long miles, but in its atmosphere, which had become warmer and less careful, the way atmosphere becomes when a significant secret has been exchanged and received well. She rode as Eliza Crane and felt the name fitting back around her like a garment that had been stored away and was being put on again. It still fit. She had been afraid it might not. Matthew rode beside her and they talked about the land and about cattle and about what the next season would look like, and also about other things, smaller things. The particular call of the scissor-tailed flycatcher that they saw twice on the return trail. The way the cedar gave way to the open grass as they came north. The color of the light in the late afternoon when it hit the limestone escarpments of the hill country. On the second night of the return, camped again in open country, he said, "I'd like to call you Eliza." "You've been doing it since Fredericksburg," she pointed out. "I've been doing it when the conversation called for it," he said. "I'd like permission to do it generally." "As the name I use for you." She looked at him across the camp. "You have it," she said. He nodded, satisfied, as if something had been properly settled. "Eliza," he said, not leading to anything, just saying it, the way you say a word you want to remember. She smiled. It was not a performance or a social grace. It was a real smile, starting somewhere inside her and coming out without her managing it, and she saw the effect of it on him, the way he looked at her as if the smile was something he was going to think about later. They arrived back in Caldwell on a Friday evening in late June, and went directly to the land office, which was still open because Pratt kept late hours on Fridays. They presented the Birch statement and explained to Pratt that there was a matter of a corrected filing that needed to be made, and Irene laid out the full situation with the precision and calm she had been practicing in her head since the Pecan Grove in Fredericksburg, and Cyrus Pratt, to his credit, listened to all of it and then sat for a moment in the particular silence of a man who is genuinely thinking rather than performing thought. The alias was used to escape a situation of duress, he said. Not to defraud the federal government. Correct, Irene said. The land was legitimately available. The filing fee was properly paid. The improvements have been made in good faith. Pratt looked at the Birch statement. He looked at the original filing. He looked at Irene for a long moment. I'll process a corrected filing, he said. Your claim will go on record as belonging to Eliza Me Crane, with a notation that a previous filing was made under a pseudonym for documented personal reasons. I'll attach a letter of explanation and send the whole packet to the regional office in Wichita. He paused. It's possible they'll have questions. I'll answer them, she said. I don't doubt it, he said. She signed the corrected filing as Eliza Me Crane, and the pen moving across the paper felt like stepping out of a tunnel, the particular quality of light when you've been moving through enclosed dark, and then the world opens up again and the sky is simply there, enormous and indifferent and perfect. Matthew was standing beside her when she signed, not hovering, not managing, just present, the way he was present in all things, with a steady and uncrowded attention. Outside on the step of the land office, in the late June evening with the cattle town going on around them and the smell of dust and horses and cook fires on the warm air, she stood beside him and thought that she had never expected to arrive at a moment like this one, this simple and open in this flat and enormous country. Thank you, she said, for coming with me, for listening, for not making me feel like I'd done something unforgivable. You didn't do something unforgivable, he said. You survived. He looked at her with the gray eyes that she had come to think of as the most honest eyes she had ever looked into. And you built something worth surviving for. That's not nothing, Eliza. She took a breath. I should tell you something else, she said. He waited. I think I've been falling in love with you since approximately the morning you told me about the river ford, she said. And I've been trying to stop because I thought the name would eventually matter and then everything would come apart. She stopped. It didn't come apart. He looked at her for a moment that felt large and still. No, he said, it didn't. He reached out and took her hand, the way you take someone's hand when you've been wanting to do it for a long time, and you've finally decided that the wanting is larger than the caution. His hand was warm and steady. I've been in love with you since you walked into that coffee house and asked Mrs. Bauer for a cup without smiling at her, because you could tell she didn't want to be smiled at and you respected that. She laughed. She hadn't expected to laugh, and she didn't try to manage it. It came out free and genuine, and he looked at her laughing with an expression that was so openly delighted it turned something over inside her. That is a very specific thing to fall in love with someone over, she said. I'm a specific person, he said. She squeezed his hand. Arvid Chance attempted one more challenge in July, through his Wichita lawyer, and when the lawyer discovered that not only was the Birch statement in the file, but that the claim correction had been processed and supported by the regional office, and that the filing was now in the name of a woman who was very clearly prepared to argue every point in every court available to her, the lawyer advised Chance to drop it. Chance dropped it. He went north to buy a parcel near Dodge City instead, which was ultimately more convenient for his cattle operation anyway, and the whole matter resolved without a courtroom appearance, which was exactly what Irene had hoped for. She went back to being Eliza Crane in Caldwell and found, as weeks passed, that it required less explaining than she had feared. The people who mattered already knew, Mrs. Harker and Loretta Ashby and Hector Vega, and the people who didn't know simply encountered her as the woman on parcel 47 on the Salt Fork, and nobody much cared about the details of her filing as long as she was a good neighbor and paid her debts on time, which she was and did. Matthew began coming to supper on Thursday evenings as a standing arrangement, and she began riding to his ranch on Sunday mornings so they could go to the church service together, and then spend the afternoon in the kind of conversation that had become, over the summer months, the most important conversation of her life. They talked about everything. They disagreed sometimes, about small things and occasionally larger ones, and when they disagreed they did it straight on, neither of them retreating or softening beyond what was genuine, and they always came back to the same place, which was a place of fundamental understanding that felt to her like being comprehended, which was different from being known in the way a town knows a name. In August, he kissed her for the first time. They were standing on the bank of the Salt Fork in the early evening with the water low and clear, and the cottonwoods heavy with late summer leaf, and he had been showing her something in the water, some plant he had noticed that indicated good mineral content in the soil, and they were both crouching at the edge of the bank, close together as you have to be when you are looking at the same small thing, and he turned to say something and she was looking at him, and neither of them moved for a moment, and then he kissed her. Simple and direct, with the same character as everything he did, and it was warm and unhurried, and she kissed him back with a wholeness that surprised her, as if she had been waiting not for the specific action but for the person, and here he was. They pulled back and looked at each other. "That's been waiting a while," he said. "Yes," she agreed. He smiled, and the cottonwoods reflected in the water, and a red-winged blackbird flew low over the river, and she thought that the Salt Fork bottomland was the most beautiful place in the world. By September, her garden had produced well past what she could eat or trade, and she had made arrangements with a hotel in town and 2 families she had become friendly with to take surplus vegetables, and she had put up preserves enough to last the winter and dried herbs in bunches along the cabin ceiling, and smoked a small quantity of meat from a deer that Matthew had shot, and which they had processed together over 2 days in early September. Her doing the work she was capable of and him doing the heavier portions, both of them capable of asking for what they needed from the other, which was the thing, she had come to understand, that made a working partnership out of 2 people. He asked her to marry him on a Sunday afternoon in October when the cottonwoods were in their fall gold and the light on the river was amber and exact. He asked her on her own land, which she thought was the right place for it. He stood in the doorway of her cabin, the cabin Vega had finished, on the land that was now indisputably and legally hers, and he said, "I would like to make a life with you, Eliza, if you'll have me." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about all of it, every piece of it, the borrowed name and the long trail and the fire and the cedar draw and Thomas Birch's pecan grove and the river ford and the first cup of coffee, and the smile that had rearranged his face the first time she had seen it fully. "Yes," she said, "I'll have you." They were married in November of 1882 at the small church in Caldwell, on a morning so clear and cold the air had edges, with Mrs. Harker and Loretta Ashby and Hector Vega and his wife among the witnesses, and the pastor, a serious man named Reverend Collies who had come to Caldwell the year before from Illinois, performed the ceremony with a simplicity and genuine warmth that she had not expected from a frontier church service, and which moved her more than she anticipated. She married as Eliza Crane and became Eliza Abbott, and the becoming felt clean and chosen, entirely unlike the way names had felt for the past year. Matthew had a house, she had a cabin and a piece of land. They spent the winter making decisions about what to do with both, real decisions made between 2 people who had learned to talk to each other, and by February, they had decided that she would keep her parcel and the claim, working the bottomland for the garden and eventually for a small portion of cattle that would run on the better grass, and they would live in the larger house that was more comfortable for winter, and spend time on both pieces of property through the working seasons. It was not a conventional arrangement, but it was a real one, thought through and agreed to, and that made it better than conventional. The winter of 1882 into 1883 was hard in the way Kansas winters were hard. The particular flat, open, relentless cold that Matthew had described to her on the trail. But she had a good stove and a weather-tight house, and more wood put up than she needed, and a man in the same house who had strong opinions about keeping the water from freezing and the cattle from drifting, and who was pleasant company on the long evenings when the wind made it clear that going outside was not a serious option. They read together by lamplight, which she had told him early on was the thing she missed most from her childhood with her mother, and he had gone to the general store and bought 2 books, a practical one about cattle ranching in the Plains States, and a novel she had not expected from him, something by Thomas Hardy that was not new but was good, and she had looked at the Hardy with her heart doing something complicated, and he had said simply, "Someone told me once that her mother read alongside her." And she had put her hand over her mouth for a moment and then composed herself and said, "Thank you," in a voice that was smaller than usual. In the spring of 1883, she discovered she was pregnant. She told him in the early morning while the coffee was making, sitting at the kitchen table with the March light coming in the east window, flat and bright. And she told him directly because that was the way they told each other things, and she watched his face while she told him. He was very still for a moment. Then he put his hand over hers on the table, and the expression that moved across his face was something she had not seen before from him, not quite any of the expressions she had catalogued over the preceding year. It was larger than those, softer, something to do with the depth of what the moment was asking of him. "Are you all right?" he asked, his first question. "I'm well," she said, "a little tired, but well." He looked at her for a long moment. "A baby," he said, as if he needed to say it aloud to make it fully real. "A baby," she confirmed. He brought her hand up and pressed it to his lips, a gesture so simply tender that she felt it all the way to the center of her chest. "Eliza," he said, and it sounded the way her name had sounded in the firelight in the cedar draw, like a thing that was exactly what it was supposed to be. The summer of 1883 was the best growing season the Salt Fork bottomland had seen in several years, rich with water from a wet spring, and her garden produced with an abundance that became almost comic in its generosity. She was through the first difficult months by June and feeling well again, and she worked alongside Matthew and the hands through the summer with modifications for sense, but without stopping, because she was not a person who stopped, and because the work was good and the land was good, and she was happy in a way that she had not known she was capable of being. Loretta Ashby threw a small supper in her honor in August when it was obvious enough that people were saying things on the street, and Mrs. Harker sent over a jar of preserved peaches with a note that said simply, "For the hard days, of which there will be some." She kept the peaches on the kitchen shelf like a talisman and ate them slowly over the autumn and thought of Mrs. Harker every time. The baby was born in October of 1883, on a cold and clear night with the cottonwoods stripped of their gold by the first hard frost and the stars doing their architectural thing above the flat country. It was a boy. He arrived with some difficulty and a great deal of noise, both his own and Irene's, and the woman who came to help, a capable midwife from the south part of town named Mrs. Salazar, who had delivered more babies in Caldwell County than she could count, said afterward that he was a fine, strong boy and that his mother had done very well and should rest. Matthew had waited outside the bedroom door for 3 hours, and when Mrs. Salazar opened the door and said it was done and they were both well, he made a sound she had never heard from him before, a single brief sound that was released from somewhere deep and structural, and she heard it from the bed and called his name, and he came in and sat beside her and looked at the boy in her arms with an expression that she thought she would carry inside her for the rest of her life. "He looks like someone important," Matthew said softly. "He looks like himself," she said. They named him James. James Thomas Abbott, the Thomas for Thomas Birch of Fredericksburg, who had given back something that allowed all the rest of this to happen, and she thought about the man in the pecan grove who had built his house on the edge of his grief, and had still known how to do the right thing when it was asked of him. James was a vigorous, loud, extremely opinionated baby who expressed his views about sleep schedules with a clarity that left no ambiguity about his feelings. Matthew, who had spent years working with cattle that had their own very specific ideas about where they wanted to go and when, adapted to the experience with the same patient, practical attention he brought to everything else, rising in the night without drama, walking the length of the house with James against his shoulder, talking to him in the quiet way he talked to things that needed settling. And Eliza would lie in the warm bed listening to the low murmur of her husband's voice, and the baby gradually quieting. And she would think about how many versions of her life she had almost lived instead of this one. By the spring of 1884, James was sitting up and grabbing at everything within reach, and Eliza's parcel on the Salt Fork had its first small herd of cattle on it, 8 head that she had bought carefully and with money from the previous season's garden surplus and from the egg sales, which had grown as she had added to the flock. It was a beginning, modest but real, the kind of beginning that comes from doing a thing with attention and patience rather than capital. Hector Vega built a small outbuilding on the Salt Fork parcel that spring, a combination storage shed and working area, and when he was done he stood back and looked at the whole of the property, the cabin and the garden and the fencing and the beginnings of the cattle operation, and he said, "Good work." And she was not sure if he meant his own or hers or both, and she decided he meant both, which was the right answer. Loretta Ashby sold her poultry operation in the fall of 1884 and moved to live near her sister in Lawrence, and before she left she and Eliza had a long afternoon on Loretta's porch with good tea and a conversation that went many places, and at the end of it Loretta said, "You know, when you first came to buy those hens, I thought you were doing that thing some women do when they come out here, where they think hard work is the same as running away." "Was I?" Eliza asked. "Maybe at first," Loretta said, "but you stopped running somewhere around the middle of your first summer. I could see it. You started arriving." Eliza thought about that for a while after Loretta's wagon had gone down the road. She thought it was accurate. There was a difference between being somewhere because you were fleeing somewhere else and being somewhere because you had decided it was where you were. She had arrived somewhere around the time she was kneeling in the Bean Rose, or maybe the evening of the first supper, or maybe the morning in Fredericksburg, when Thomas Birch called her Miss Crane, and it had felt like her name landing in the right place after a long misdelivery. In the winter of 1884, the letter came. It came from a lawyer in Abilene, forwarded to Caldwell with no explanation for how it had found her there, addressed to Eliza Me Crane, which meant that whoever had sent it had done their research. She opened it with a careful quality of attention at the kitchen table with Matthew across from her, who had noticed the envelope and was waiting. It was from Gerald Marsh. Not written by him. He would not have engaged a lawyer himself. He was too careful with money for that, but sent through a legal intermediary. It informed her in the formal language of legal correspondence that Gerald Marsh had become aware of her presence in Kansas and wished to discuss the matter of her mother's personal estate, which had remained in dispute since her departure in 1882. She read it twice. She put it down on the table. "Gerald," she said, "your stepfather." "Yes." Matthew reached across and read the letter without touching it, then looked at her. "What does he want?" "What he always wants," she said. "Control. Leverage. If he's claiming my mother's estate as a point of dispute, he's trying to open a legal door." She thought for a moment. "My mother left a small amount of personal property, some household items, jewelry, a small amount in a bank account. Gerald was never entitled to any of it, but he took it anyway, claiming it as marital property, and I left without fighting because I didn't have the resources to fight, and because I needed to leave." She paused. "He wants to either formalize that taking or use the threat of a dispute to bring me back into a situation where he has some power." "He won't succeed," Matthew said. "No," she agreed, "but I need to respond to it properly." She looked at him. "I need to write to Harmon Dye." Harmon Dye was engaged, and the correspondence that followed over the subsequent months was thorough and methodical. Di established several important points on her behalf: that Eliza had reached the age of majority before leaving and was not subject to any ongoing guardianship, that Gerald Marsh's claim to Clara Crane's personal property was legally questionable given the specific terms of Clara's will, a copy of which was obtained through the Meridian courthouse records, and that Eliza had legitimate claims of her own to portions of her mother's estate that had never been formally settled. The process took the better part of 5 months, during which Eliza went about her life on the Salt Fork and in Caldwell with the same steadiness she brought to everything. And in April of 1885, Harmon Di sent her a letter saying that Gerald Marsh had withdrawn his inquiry after receiving a detailed account of what he stood to face if he pursued it, including the potential for a counterclaim that would have been both expensive and embarrassing. Additionally, a small amount of money, the remainder of the bank account that had belonged to Clara Crane and which Gerald had transferred but not entirely spent, was ordered returned to Eliza through a civil settlement that required no courtroom appearance and was arranged entirely by correspondence. It was not a large amount, but it was her mother's, and it had come back to the right place, and she sat at the kitchen table with the letter in her hands and Matthew watching her from across the room, and she said, very quietly, "It's over. That part is over." He came and put his arms around her from behind, standing at the table, and she leaned her head back against his chest, and they stayed like that for a while in the spring afternoon. And James, who was 18 months old and extremely mobile, crawled through the kitchen doorway and pulled himself upright on Eliza's skirt and said something emphatic and entirely unintelligible that both of them heard as a comment on the situation. "He agrees it's over," Matthew said. She laughed. It came out full and free and completely unmanaged, the kind of laughter that has relief in it and joy in it, and the very specific quality of having survived something and come out the other side into clear air. The summer of 1885 was hot, and the cattle market in Caldwell was good, and the Salt Fork bottomland produced its third year of solid crops, and she expanded the herd to 22 head and brought on a part-time hand named Gil Espinosa, a young man of 19 who had come up from Texas with a cattle drive and decided he preferred the territory to going back, and who was a competent and willing worker. She paid him fair wages and housed him in a small addition that Vega put on the outbuilding, and he was grateful without being obsequious about it, which she appreciated. Matthew's ranch was growing too. He had added to his herd and his hay production, and was making arrangements with one of the Texas operations to provide pasture for a portion of their cattle on the spring drive, which was a sound business relationship. He worked hard and thought carefully, and came home every evening with the particular quality of tiredness that comes from satisfying work rather than punishing circumstance. They ate supper together every evening, her and Matthew and James, who was by now 2 years old and talking in long, earnest sentences that sometimes made sense and sometimes appeared to be in a language he had invented for his own purposes. He was a serious, curious child with his father's gray eyes and his mother's habit of reading signs and noticing things, and he loved the Salt Fork bottomland with an uncomplicated and absolute love that was exactly the love she had hoped someone would one day feel for it. In the fall of 1886, Eliza learned she was pregnant again. She told Matthew in the same way as the first time, in the early morning at the kitchen table with the October light coming in, and his response was the same in its essential character, the hand over hers, the stillness, the same expression that was larger and softer than his ordinary expressions. "Are you happy?" she asked, because she wanted to hear it said. "I am so happy," he said, with a simplicity that did not reach for decoration, "that I don't quite know what to do with it." She smiled at him across the table in the October morning and thought that she understood exactly what he meant. The second child came in April of 1887, in the spring, when the Salt Fork was high with snowmelt and the cottonwoods were pushing out their first new leaves, and the meadowlarks were back from wherever meadowlarks went and singing their long songs over the prairie. It was a girl this time, smaller than James had been, with dark hair like her mother's and a remarkably calm temperament from the first hour, as if she had assessed the situation and found it satisfactory. They named her Clara, for the woman who had read alongside her daughter by lamplight and taught her without knowing it how to survive. James came to look at Clara with the grave and important attention of a 3-year-old encountering something genuinely new, and declared after a long inspection that she was small. This was accurate. He patted her head with 2 fingers carefully, and then went back to whatever he had been doing before, satisfied that he had done his duty by the investigation. The years after that were good years, full of the particular substance of a life being built with intention and care. Eliza's parcel grew and improved. The cattle herd was solid. The garden was legendary among the women of Caldwell. People asked her about it the way they asked experts about things. Gil Espinosa stayed on, married a woman from a Mexican-American family south of the line in 1888, a capable and warm woman named Rosalinda, and the 2 of them became friends to Eliza and Matthew in the way that good neighbors become friends, through shared work and shared meals, and the accumulation of small, reliable things. James started school in Caldwell in 1889, riding into town with his father on the days Matthew was going in anyway and walking the 2 miles home in the afternoons with a serious air that suggested he took the responsibility of education as seriously as his mother once had. He had her habit with books. He read with an appetite that was familiar to her in its shape, and she fed it in the way her mother had fed hers, sitting alongside him in the evenings with the lamp between them. Clara was a different creature, more physical and less interior, fascinated by the cattle and by the horses and by the river, which she could look at for long periods of time in a way that suggested she was thinking about it rather than simply looking. She was fearless in a way that required management, and loved the land with a practical rather than a contemplative love, which was exactly the love the land needed from someone who was going to be working it. In 1890, Caldwell was changing. The cattle drives were thinning as the railroads pushed further south, and the open range gave way to fenced land, and the great trailing days that had made the town were drawing toward their end. It was a change that some people mourned and some people saw as simple progress, and most people, Eliza included, understood as both, which was the only accurate way to understand most changes. The land office was still busy, but with a different kind of business now, more homesteading and farming, fewer cattle deals and frontier negotiations. Cyrus Pratt retired, and a younger man took his place, and the town got a second church and a proper school building and a newspaper, and the character of it shifted in the slow, inevitable way that frontier towns shift when they stop being frontier towns. She and Matthew went to a town meeting in the fall of 1890, at which there was considerable discussion about the future of Caldwell's economy and about what kind of town it was going to be, and she sat in the back row with his arm along the back of her chair and listened to men with various opinions about this, and thought about what she would say if she were asked. She was asked. Someone in the meeting, knowing she had land on the Salt Fork and had been working it for 8 years, asked what she thought about the future of agricultural operations in the area. She stood up. The room, which had perhaps 40 people in it, settled. "The land is good," she said. "The Salt Fork bottomland and the grass country around it will support cattle and farming well past any of our lifetimes. What it needs is people who are in it for the long term, not for the trail or the drive or the quick profit, but for the work of building something that lasts." She paused. "The frontier days are ending, and that's a real loss, because there was something in the openness of it that mattered. But what comes after doesn't have to be lesser. It can be deeper, a community instead of a passage." She stopped. "That's what I think." She sat down. Matthew's hand found hers under the edge of the chair. In the spring of 1891, she walked the full perimeter of her parcel for the first time in years, just walked it, in the early morning before the house was fully awake, following the fence line from the north corner around through the hackberry stand and the eastern timber and along the river and back. It took an hour and a half, and she walked slowly, because she wanted to see all of it. The cabin where she had first lived was still standing, though they used it now for storage and occasionally for Gil and Rosalinda when work kept them on that side of the property late. The fence was straight and in good repair. The garden, which would be planted again in a few weeks, was a rectangle of rich dark soil that smelled, even in early spring, of everything it had produced. The cottonwoods along the river were enormous now, or seemed so, or perhaps she was measuring them against the memory of what they looked like the first April morning she had stood among them. She stopped on the riverbank and looked south across the water the way she had looked that first morning, and she thought about Irene Holloway, the real woman, the widow who had died in the St. Louis flood, and whose name had been borrowed by a woman who needed one. And she hoped that somewhere in whatever accounting was kept of such things, Irene Holloway knew that her name had been used carefully, had been put to work on something real, and had been returned as best as names can be returned, to the record books where it was corrected and settled. She thought about her mother, Clara, who was in the name of her daughter now and in the habit of reading by lamplight, and in the particular quality of not stopping that Eliza had carried across 400 miles of hard country and had turned into a life. She thought about Matthew, sleeping in the house 4 miles northwest where James and Clara were also sleeping, who had asked for her real name and then done what real names require, which is to say he had treated it with care. She turned and walked back toward the cabin, and the morning light came across the prairie in the way that Kansas morning light comes, flat and gold and specific, making each thing visible and particular, the fence posts and the hackberry and the garden soil and the rough plank wall of the cabin, all of it exactly what it was and exactly where it was supposed to be. She was home. She had always been capable of it, the arriving, the staying. It had taken a borrowed name and a long trail and a gray-eyed man who asked the right question to find the place where the capability could put itself to use. But she had found it, and she had built on it, and it was real. She made the coffee. A while later she heard his horse on the trail, the familiar unhurried sound of it that she had been hearing for 9 years now, and that still made something uncomplicated and glad happen in her chest, and she poured a second cup and set it on the step, and when Matthew came around the hackberry stand she was standing in the doorway with both cups and the morning behind her in the cabin, warm and certain. He pulled up at the fence and looked at her. She looked at him. "Early start," he said. "I walked the fence line," she said. "Come have coffee." He tied the horse and came through the gate and took the cup she handed him and stood beside her on the step, and they looked out at the Salt Fork bottomland in the April morning, the river running clear, and the cottonwoods coming into leaf again for the 9th spring in a row, and James and Clara were going to ride out later, and there was planting to begin and a full working season ahead of them, and everything was exactly as it should be. "What were you thinking about?" he asked. "On the fence line." She considered. "Everything," she said, "all of it from the beginning." He looked at her with the gray eyes that still did not flinch or slide away from difficult things, and would not for as long as she knew him, which was going to be a very long time. "Good everything or hard everything?" he asked. "Both," she said, "which is the same thing from far enough away." He put his free arm around her, and she leaned into him, and they stood on the step of the cabin that had been built on the land that she had claimed under a name that was not hers, and that she had kept under the name that was, and the cottonwoods moved in the morning breeze along the Salt Fork, and the meadowlarks sang over the grass, and the sky was enormous and blue, and without condition. The prairie stretched away in every direction, wide and various and alive, holding all of them, the ranches and the town and the river, and the graves of those who had come before, and the beginnings of those who would come after, holding all of it without preference or judgment, the way good country holds the people who choose to belong to it. She held her coffee and let herself be held and thought that this was what arriving felt like. She had not known it, 9 years ago, standing outside a land office in the spring dust with a borrowed name and an iron resolve. She had not known that arriving was not a single moment but a continuous choosing, every morning and every season, to be in the place you have decided is yours. But she knew it now. And the morning went on, bright and particular and real, over the Salt Fork bottomland that was hers, that had always been going to be hers, that she had found her way to down a long and winding road made of necessity and courage, and one gray-eyed man who had asked her, simply and without agenda, for the real one.